All right, folks. Hopefully everybody can get back in and get settled down. We're going to go ahead and pick back up where we left off. Next up, we have Sheri Crabtree. I'm going to be doing a talk on growing perennial fruits and nuts. Sheri is a horticulture research and extension associate at KSU. She specializes in tree fruits, small fruits, nuts, and particularly pawpaw, persimmon, and blackberry, and other niche fruits. Her areas of focus include breeding, variety trials, propagation, value-added product development, conducting orchard tours and workshops, and assisting fruit and nut growers from commercial orchards to hobbyists. Sheri has a bachelor's in horticulture and a master's in plant and soil science from the University of Kentucky and has been with KSU for 22 years.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Hope everybody had a good break. Like you said, my name is Sheri Crabtree. I am a horticulture research and extension associate here at KSU. A lot of you may know me from the pawpaw world if you've come to our pawpaw Third Thursday things. So we will just get into it, growing perennial fruit and nut crops. So first, just a little bit about fruit production in Kentucky in general, because there's a lot of things about growing fruits and nuts that are the same for lots of different species, so we don't have to go through, growing requirements for every single fruit. Almost everything likes a deep, well-drained soil, lots of organic matter, and most of these crops that we'll talk about like a slightly acid to neutral pH. Most fruits also produce better in full sun. They just get more energy from the sunlight, more energy to flower and set fruit and grow fruit. Also, you want good air circulation, which can help prevent diseases, but you do want them protected from strong winds. We saw just a couple of weeks ago these 60, 70 mile an hour winds that went through here that broke a lot of our fruit tree limbs. So somewhere where there's a wind break or some protection from strong winds, and also not in the lowest lying areas, because cold air is denser or heavier than warm air. And so when we get these cold temperatures in the spring, the cold air tends to settle in low-lying areas, and plants that are planted in those areas are going to be more prone to frost and freeze damage. So you want them kind of on the upper end of slopes generally. And it's always better to do soil tests before you plant. It's easier to amend the soil before you get the plants in than it is to try to amend the soil afterwards. And your county extension agent can help with soil testing. They have soil test kits that they can help you collect and send in, so you find out if your soil is deficient in any nutrients and you need to amend it ahead of time before planting. Weed control, irrigation, fertilization is going to be important for all the things that we talk about. Generally, all these fruit crops, pruning is in early spring. That's one of the first things that you do. Also, we have a lot of insect and disease problems in Kentucky. So hot, humid summers, a lot of moisture on the leaves. Sometimes we have clay soils that are a little bit heavier that make them more prone to root rot. So insect and disease pressure can be higher in Kentucky. And we also get a lot of these late spring frosts and freeze events. We'll warm up early. This happened last week before last. We get warm really early in the spring. Everything will start growing and bloom, and then we get cold again and it kills it back. So for those reasons, you want to select cold hardy or late blooming varieties of all these crops that we're going to talk about here in a minute, and disease resistant cultivars are some of the most important things. You also want to think about how much space you have. If you don't have a lot of space, you want to choose plants that are smaller, or if we're talking about apple trees or peach trees, you want to choose dwarf varieties that will take up less room. And again, pretty much all of these you're harvesting earlier in the day and getting in the refrigerator as quickly as possible to have a longer shelf life. So all of these crops that we're going to talk about, there is a fruit and nut cultivar nursery source list that UK put out that was just revised a couple of years ago. And ideally you want to have a diverse selection of different fruits and nuts to have the potential to harvest all throughout the year. So you've got things like strawberries that start fruiting in the spring, all the way to persimmons that fruit late in the fall. So as far as tree fruit production in Kentucky, the most common fruits that we see grown commercially in Kentucky are apples and peaches. However, like I mentioned, there's a lot of disease and insect pressure, and these are not as resistant to disease and insect problems as some of our native plants. We also see a lot of problems with late spring frosts. Our peaches were in full bloom, and then we had this freeze last week that killed most of the flowers. But tree fruits do have a high per acre income. So for that reason, we focus here at KSU on more native fruits and nuts. Pawpaw is one of the crops that we do most of our research on. They're better suited for the climate and growing conditions in Kentucky and can be grown more low input. We try to focus on sustainable agriculture and low input production. So these are some of the tree fruits that we are going to cover today. So pawpaw, I'm going to start with that because that is one of the main crops that we do research on here at KSU. How many of you all have eaten pawpaws before, familiar with them? Okay, yeah, it looks like maybe about half of you, a third of you. If you haven't tasted pawpaw before, they have a really unique kind of tropical, tutti fruity flavor. If you haven't tasted them before, the best description is kind of a blend of mango and banana for the flavor. And the texture is soft, a creamy texture, kind of like a ripe avocado. And you see the skin is green, and when you cut them open inside, they have a yellow to orange colored flesh. They're very nutritious, high in lots of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants. They're a fairly small tree, so if you don't have a huge space, pawpaw is a good choice. They get 15 to 20 feet tall generally, and you can prune them to keep them a little bit smaller. In mature trees, you're looking at about 35 to 50 pounds of fruit per tree, yield-wise. And these fruits in late summer, early fall. So we start harvesting our pawpaws the end of August and go through the end of September. So one thing about pawpaws, you do need at least 2 trees for cross-pollination. If you have a single tree, sometimes they'll set a few fruit, but they generally don't set a lot of fruit through self-pollination. About 8 to 10 feet between trees is the recommended planting distance, and spring planting is better for pawpaw trees. So if you're starting them from seed especially, they do need some shade the first couple of years until they're about 1.5 feet tall. Pawpaws are sensitive to full sun and need some shade, but after that they can grow in full sun and have higher yields in full sun. And one great thing about pawpaws, being a native plant, there's not a lot of insect pests and diseases that bother pawpaws, so it's a good crop, a good choice to grow organically or low input. And you can grow them yourself from seed, so if you eat a pawpaw fruit and you want to save the seed, put it in the refrigerator over the winter and plant it in the spring, you can do that, but pawpaws are not true to type from seed. So if you have a fruit and you eat it and it's really good, you save the seed and plant it, it's not going to be identical to the parent. It's going to be a cross of the 2 parents. So to propagate cultivars true to type, they're grafted. Pawpaws won't root from cutting. So grafting is when you basically have a seedling that you've grown up that's a couple of years old. You take a cutting off of the tree that you want to propagate, and you make kind of a V-shaped cut and fit those 2 together, wrap it up, and that will grow up into the new tree. But you can propagate them yourself by seed if it doesn't bother you that it's not identical to the tree that you got it from. So pawpaws are native to Kentucky and most of the eastern U.S. You usually find them in the understory of hardwood forests, usually along rivers and creeks, environments like that. And they'll form these big patches, like the song Way Down Yonder in the Pawpaw Patch. And it can look like hundreds of trees in these patches, but they're all from one root system usually. They spread by these root suckers and form these huge patches. And a lot of times in the wild, you don't see a lot of fruit, and that's part of the reason. Remember, they need to cross-pollinate, so if you have all these shoots from one root system, they're all identical genetically. So it looks like a lot of trees, but there's not anything different for them to cross-pollinate with. A lot of times you also will find lower quality fruit on the wild trees. They can be small or have a lot of seeds or have bitter flavors. But there are strategies you can use to manage wild patches to help maximize fruit production in the wild patches. You do want to thin them out a little bit so they're about 8 feet apart between the trees. Cut out anything that's shading them. So if you've got larger trees over them that are giving heavy shade, you can prune those to get a little bit more light into the pawpaws, and also clear out anything, bush honeysuckles and invasive species that kind of gets in the same niche as pawpaw. Clear out anything that is competing with the pawpaws. And you can also bring in seedlings or grafted trees from somewhere else to plant in the patch to have something genetically different to cross-pollinate with to improve diversity, and then you get higher fruit set. A lot of people ask about transplanting root suckers. Can I dig up these little root suckers and move them? That can be hard to do because pawpaws have a taproot. They naturally have a really deep taproot, and the root suckers are more attached by kind of a runner root. And so the best way to do that is if you cut around the root sucker with a shovel, just in a circle around it, and leave it for a year, and it will develop a little bit more of its own root system. Then you can dig it and transplant it the following year, is the best way to do that. So here at KSU, one of the main things we do in our pawpaw research program, we're breeding new improved varieties that do well in Kentucky. And so these are some pawpaw cultivars that we recommend for this area. KSU Atwood is one that came from our breeding program. It has kind of a mango flavor. It's a little bit later ripening, so usually about the middle of September is when Atwood ripens. KSU Benson is another one from our breeding program. It's early ripening, usually about late August is when Benson ripens. It's got this really round shape. And KSU Chappelle is our most recent cultivar release. It's kind of in the middle, so usually early September is when Chappelle starts ripening. It's very vigorous, fast growing, has kind of a banana pineapple flavor to it. So have a really unique flavor, not a lot of seeds. So all of those, they were developed here at KSU and in trials here, so they're going to do well in this area. These are some other pawpaw cultivars that have performed well in variety trials here. NC1 Overleaf, which has kind of a cantaloupe flavor, and Sunflower, which has a milder flavor. And some people that haven't eaten pawpaws a lot tend to like the ones that have a little bit milder flavors to them. Okay, some other varieties that have done well in trials here. Peterson pawpaws, this was a breeder in West Virginia, so those are all, developed pretty close to this area, do well in this growing zone. Potomac has really large, nice fruit. Shenandoah is another milder flavored pawpaw. Wabash. Susquehanna is a really nice flavored, it's won a lot of taste tests when we have them here or at the Ohio Pawpaw Festival. A lot of times Susquehanna is a lot of people's favorite flavor-wise. So there are a few nurseries in Kentucky that sell pawpaw trees. England's Orchard Nursery, which is down close to Berea, Peaceful Heritage Nursery that's in Lincoln County, and Oakland Farm Trees that is in Paris. But also the Kentucky State Division of Forestry sells pawpaw seedlings in larger quantities, kind of in bundles of 10 or 50 or 100 in the larger quantities. All of these tend to sell out pretty quickly, so it may be the kind of thing, get in touch with them, order them ahead of time, get on a wait list. So pawpaw fruit, when they are ripe, they have a very short shelf life. They're soft, they bruise easily, they don't last a long time at room temperature. So you can eat them fresh or sell them fresh if you're looking to sell them. But since they have such a short shelf life, you can freeze them for longer term storage. And then you can use them in recipes. So pawpaw ice cream, if you've ever been here at an event where we sell the pawpaw ice cream, serve the pawpaw ice cream, makes a really good ice cream since the fruit has kind of a creamy flavor. But you can also use it in cooking as a banana substitute. So basically any recipes that call for bananas, you can substitute pawpaw for bananas in those recipes. As far as if you're growing pawpaws, where to sell them, or if you're looking for where to buy fruit, where you can buy them, generally farmers markets is the best place to look for them, starting in early September is kind of when the season starts. Some local produce markets, so places like Good Foods Co-op in Lexington, Paul's Fruit Market in Louisville, kind of more small specialty stores will sell pawpaw fruit. And if you have fruit that you're growing that you're looking to sell, wineries and breweries and distilleries have kind of become the biggest market for Pawpaw fruit in Kentucky, they buy just about all that people will produce. So that's also some local restaurants, that do kind of the farm to table, local foods, are interested in pawpaw fruit. Oh, my clicker is not wanting to. Okay, whoop, too far. Okay, so Dr. Pomper mentioned this, but our third Thursday thing is in September. It's also National Pawpaw Day, so that's September 21st this year. And it's right here, the same room at the farm. So we'll have fruit to taste, we'll have the famous pawpaw ice cream, we'll have orchard tours, things like that. We also are going to have a tree grafting workshop coming up on May 5th. And that will be on Eventbrite, so the land grant, the KSU land grant page where you got the tickets to this event. Make sure you're following that if you're interested in the tree grafting workshop, because that will be posted on Eventbrite. So moving on to another native fruit crop, persimmon. American persimmon is native to this area, southeast and midwestern U.S. What you see in the grocery stores that's larger are Asian persimmons. And those we can't grow here because they're not cold hardy. If it gets to about 0 to 10 above Fahrenheit, they will die back to the ground, and we generally get colder than that every winter. So American persimmon is what we grow here. They're pretty tolerant of a lot of different soil types and environments. They do have a little bit smaller fruit than the Asian persimmon, so about 1 to 2 inch diameter fruit. And similar to pawpaws, they'll start bearing, it takes a few years, so grafted trees 3 to 5 years, seedlings take a little bit longer. And so persimmon has male and female trees separate, and female trees are what produces fruit. So some recommended cultivars for persimmon, early golden, Yates, John Rick are some that you see most commonly. Meter is one that is self-fruitful that you don't need a pollinator for, and so it can produce seedless fruit. Since it doesn't get pollinated, it won't produce seeds in the fruit. Persimmon is also a fall crop a little bit later than pawpaws, so usually October is when they ripen, and if possible, you want to keep the little cap on when you pick them so it doesn't tear and they store longer. And you can also freeze these for longer term storage, so they are a softer fruit. And I do want to mention, as far as ripening in October, has anybody eaten an underripe persimmon before? A few of you, so you know, they're very astringent. I think I had that on an earlier slide. But anyway, yeah, they're very astringent when they're not ripe yet. So you want to make sure they're completely ripe. And a lot of times it's around frost. It can be, kind of the middle of October, and they'll be soft. So if you eat them when they're underripe, make your mouth feel like it's about to turn inside out. They're so astringent. So make sure they're completely ripe. So moving on to peaches. So peaches are something that's a little bit more mainstream than the pawpaw and persimmon. Peach being a more southern species, they like spring planting also, but they are also more prone to spring frosts and freezes. They like to, once it warms up in the spring here, they like to bloom early, and then we still get cold after that, which we've seen this year. So you want to definitely choose a site that's on higher ground to prevent spring damage from spring freezes. They're also a little bit larger trees, so about 20 feet spacing between trees on peaches. You definitely want a well-drained soil because they're a little bit prone to root rots. Now, peaches are self-fertile, and there are different types. There's yellow flesh peaches, there's white flesh peaches. There are cling, which means that the flesh clings to the stone in the middle, and freestone, which means that you cut them in half and the stone comes out freely. Usually cling is used for canning because cling peaches are firmer, and freestone is more for fresh eating. So as far as planting peaches, they fruit a little bit earlier, so usually in 2 to 4 years you'll get fruit off of peaches. However, one drawback to peaches, I don't know what I did, is that there are a lot of bacterial and fungal diseases. So they usually need a spray program, fungicides, insecticides. So they do need pruning, so you want to prune them to an open shape, an open vase. so they get good light penetration. So that will help with airflow. All these fungal diseases need wet surfaces, wet fruit and wet leaf surfaces. So if you prune them, one, it lets sunlight get in, the fruit will color up better with sunlight, but also lets airflow so the leaf surfaces and fruit surfaces dry faster. You also need to thin peaches. If you don't thin them, you'll get what you see on the lower right. You'll get a ton of fruit all bunched together, and they won't size up well. They'll stay small. They'll be poor quality because there's not enough sugars to go around, so they won't have good flavor, and it'll also break the limbs on the trees. So you do need to just hand remove a lot of the fruit so they're about 6 to 8 inches apart to give them plenty of room to grow. And again, you want to choose late flowering peaches. It's really important in Kentucky, and disease-resistant varieties. And peaches start fruiting in July, is when we usually see the earliest ripening varieties. And some of those, Red Haven is one of the most popular peach varieties that's pretty early ripening. Gala is another one. Then mid-season, August, Contender and Cresthaven are both really good disease-resistant peaches. And late season, we see Encore, Flame Prince, Blushing Star, some that do well in Kentucky. They're a little bit more disease-resistant. And similar to a lot of the other fruits that we talked about, they do bruise easily. A soft peach is pretty soft. So you want to handle them gently when you pick them. Don't stack them super deep in a basket. And so a tree, you'll see about 4 to 6 bushels of yield per tree. So apple, moving on to apple, you can plant apples in the fall or the spring. They do need to cross-pollinate. So peaches were self-fertile, apples need to cross-pollinate, and you want to choose a variety that has a similar bloom time with apples also. And dwarf apple trees, if you don't have a lot of room, you want to make sure that you choose a dwarf or a semi-dwarf apple tree because the full-size apple trees can get quite large and be hard to reach them, to harvest them, and things like that. So apples, you usually prune them to what's called a central leader that you see on the lower left of the screen, kind of a Christmas tree shape, a pyramidal shape. And apples also, unfortunately, have a fair amount of diseases and insect problems. So choosing resistant cultivars is important, but a lot of times you do need to spray peaches with fungicides and pesticides, unfortunately. Apples also need to be thinned similar to peaches, or else the tree will be overloaded and the fruit won't size up and you'll see limbs breaking. So again, choosing disease-resistant cultivars is key in Kentucky. The earliest apples will start ripening in July. So Williams Pride is usually the earliest. Pristine and Red Free are 2 good disease-resistant apples that are early. Mid-season, which is kind of August to September, Freedom, Empire, Gala, Liberty, these are some other disease-resistant apple varieties. Then getting into September, October, Enterprise, Gold Rush, Jonna Gold, these are good quality disease-resistant apples. Apples can be stored a lot longer than the other fruits that we talked about. As long as you get them into the refrigerator, they can usually be stored even until spring. So moving into nuts a little bit. Hickories and pecans are native to this area. They're the same genus, different species. And this is an important part of the ecosystem in Kentucky. The oak hickory forest is kind of the main forest type in Kentucky. It used to be chestnut oak until the American chestnuts died out, and then the hickory oak kind of took over. So it's an important part for animal species. Squirrels eat lots of hickory and pecan. The wood is a nice, hard, dense wood that's used a lot in furniture, other things. And also for smoking foods, and of course the nuts themselves. So pecan. Pecan is a different species from hickory. Pecans need a moist but well-drained soil. There are some varieties that are recommended for Kentucky that are scab resistant. Major, Green River, Mohawk, those are some that you see recommended often for Kentucky. Nut trees take a while to start producing, so usually 5 to 10 years at least until you'll start harvesting nuts, but they're a very long-lived tree. And pecans are fairly recently domesticated, if you want to call it that, and so a lot of the varieties that you see were just selected in the wild. People were harvesting, foraging for wild pecans, found one that had large nuts, and selected that and started propagating it. So hickory species, shellbark hickory has the largest nut of any of the hickories. It usually needs a little bit wetter soil, so it's usually found in river bottoms, areas like that have a little bit more moist soil. There are some varieties that are recommended for Kentucky, Dalton and Fayette. Fayette's self-fertile, you'll see that recommended a lot. And again, these have the largest, kind of best quality nuts for the hickories. There's also shagbark hickory that is a different species that has the shaggy bark, hence its name, kind of peeling, flaky bark. These are found in drier areas than the shellbark hickory, but again, they're a very long-lived tree, have a good-sized nut. Cook, Granger, Wilmoth are some that you see recommended for Kentucky. So pignut hickory is the most common hickory nut that you'll find growing wild in Kentucky, but unfortunately, even though it's the most common one in Kentucky, it doesn't have the best quality nuts. It doesn't crack out of the shell well, so you'll crack the shell and the nut meats will want to stay in the shell and they're hard to get out and you can't get whole nuts or halves out. But that is the most common hickory that you'll find growing wild in Kentucky. Black walnut is also a common native plant in Kentucky, and it's what's called a pioneer species. So a lot of times when a forest is cleared out or it's burned, black walnut is one of the first trees that you'll see growing in that area. And it's usually found in kind of well-drained river bottom type areas. One thing about black walnuts, they produce a compound called juglone that inhibits growth of other plants around it. So some plants are sensitive to this and some are not, so you want to make sure that you're growing something, not growing things too close to the black walnuts, or if you are, that it's resistant to juglone. Black walnuts are used for oil, the nut meats, and also the wood, of course, is important. So with all these nuts, usually they will fall on the ground when they're ready to harvest, and you can gather them off the ground. You can put tarps down on the ground to help catch the nuts and then just collect them off the tarps or kind of bundle the tarps up is an easy way to harvest them. Black walnuts, I want to mention, because a lot of people have wild black walnuts. There is this company that, Hammond's product company, that has black walnut hulling stations around the state in the fall. So they've got 21 stations all around the state where you can collect the black walnuts, hull and all, and take them there, and they have this big commercial hulling machine, and they will pay you per pound for your black walnuts. So I want to talk a little bit about berries and small fruits also. They're also perennial crops. Blackberry is the state fruit of Kentucky. Blackberry canes, a little bit about their growth habits. They will grow for 2 seasons and then they die. And so the blackberries that you're probably more familiar with only fruit on 2-year-old canes. So they grow 1 year and they're only vegetative. They don't flower and fruit. Then the second year in the summer they produce fruit, and then the year after that they die and should be removed. But there are primocane or fall fruiting blackberries that will fruit in their first year in the fall on 1-year-old canes. And so they will also fruit the next year in the summer, so you can mow them down in the winter and only get a fall crop, or you can let them grow and get a fall and then a summer crop off of them. So blackberries are also, they're native, they're pretty easy to grow organically, except unfortunately the fall fruiting blackberries, one drawback to them is the spotted winged Drosophila, which is a type of fruit fly, is at its peak in late summer, early fall, and so that's a problem on the fall fruiting blackberries. Usually the summer fruiting ones are early enough that they're not a big problem on those. So spring planting for blackberries, 2 to 3 feet between plants. Most of these cultivars that we'll recommend on the next slide are upright, so you don't need a trellis for them. And as far as pruning, remember the blackberries, the canes live 2 years and then they die. So after the second year, after they fruit, you want to remove those old canes because they're going to die anyway. You can also pinch back the canes in the spring, and that promotes branching. You get more flowering and fruiting with more branches on the canes. The fall fruiting blackberries only, you can mow them down in the wintertime and have only a fall crop. Don't do that with the summer fruiting, because then you would never get a crop, because those have to get 2 years old before they will produce fruit. But if you're growing the primocane or fall fruiting blackberries, you can mow those down in the wintertime. So some recommended varieties for Kentucky for blackberry: the summer fruiting, which is about July. Natchez, Osage, Ouachita, Ponca, and Cato are some that are thornless and upright growing. For the fall fruiting blackberries, Primark Traveler and Black Gem are thornless. Primark 45 and Black Magic are thorny. All of these are upright growing, don't need a trellis. You want to harvest these when they're fully ripe, so when the berry's black, but when it's still glossy. So it'll have a little bit longer shelf life. When they're fully ripe, they're kind of soft and they're matte black, and they won't store very long at that point. So raspberries, same species or same genus as blackberries, but a different species. So a lot of things about growing them are similar. There are both summer and fall fruiting raspberries. Similar growth habits. Raspberries need a really well-drained soil, so a lot of times people plant them on a raised bed or kind of on mounds to make sure that the soil is well-drained. They also like a little bit cooler conditions than blackberries, so a north-facing slope or even somewhere that gets a little bit of shade in the afternoon is good for raspberries. And some varieties recommended for Kentucky for the June bearing. There's several: red, black, and purple, different colors. Fall fruiting is August, October, same as the blackberries, and there are red and gold, different colors for the raspberries. So blueberries are a longer lived crop. Once you plant them, they can live 20 up to even 40 years. One tricky thing about blueberries in Kentucky, they need an acid soil, which we don't generally have in Kentucky. So they need about a 4.5 to 5.2 pH. So a lot of times you need to amend the soil with peat moss or use ammonium sulfate, or just add sulfur to the soil to help acidify the soil. And they do need to cross-pollinate. Again, blueberry, the acid soil requirement's the biggest challenge in Kentucky, and that can make you see this iron chlorosis, which is where you see these yellowish leaves. Sometimes they'll even turn a little bit reddish, and that means that they are iron deficient, which is caused by the pH being too high, and the iron is not available when the pH is too high. So that's why you see that. There are some insect pests with blueberries. There's not a lot of diseases, but Japanese beetles like to feed on blueberry foliage, and again, that spotted-winged Drosophila fruit fly. And birds are a problem, so generally you need to have a net over the blueberries. So again, there are some early, mid, and late season blueberry cultivars that are recommended for Kentucky. Duke, Patriot, Nelson, Darrow, Elliott are probably the most commonly grown and commonly recommended varieties. And again, you want to make sure that they're fully ripe when you pick them, because blueberries will not ripen off the bush. They'll not ripen any further after you pick them. But they will store on the bush a little bit longer than others, so it's not as important to get out there every day or every other day to harvest them. So strawberry, usually the first crop that we'll see in the spring at the farmers markets, or the first fruit that you'll see. These are planted in the spring, usually 2 to 2.5 feet between plants. An important thing about planting strawberries, you want to plant them where the crown is even with the ground surface. There is kind of a little raspberry crown. You don't want to bury that or plant it so it's high up out of the ground. There are different ways of growing strawberries. Matted row is usually the most common in Kentucky, but you see them grown on plastic sometimes too, or if you have limited space, you can grow them in containers. You do want to mulch them in the wintertime with straw to help prevent freeze damage. And there are some root diseases that you'll see with strawberries, so they need a well-drained soil also, or you'll see some of these root rots. So these are some varieties of strawberries that are recommended for Kentucky. There are early, mid, and later season, so that kind of ranges from May through June or July. There are also ever-bearing strawberries that will have several crops throughout the summer, which unfortunately gets into that spotted ring Drosophila time in late summer when the spotted ring Drosophila pressure is higher. Again, you want to try to harvest these with the little green cap on if possible, so they'll store a little bit longer. And like a lot of the other fruits, they bruise easily, so you don't want to stack them too deep in the containers. A lot of people do U-pick for strawberries, so people can come to your farm, pick them themselves, and pay by the pound. You can also make a lot of value-added products with strawberries. Strawberry jam, of course, is very popular. Or you can just freeze the whole fruit. So gooseberries and currants, that kind of got cut off at the top or moved up too high, kind of a unique small fruit. So gooseberries and currants are both the same species ribes, just different, same genus ribes, different species. So there are currants, there are red, white, pink, and black currants. Gooseberries are usually green, yellow, red when they're ripe. Gooseberries have thorns, currants don't, is one way that you can tell the difference. And these all have kind of a tart berry flavor. Some of them are kind of raspberry-like. Most important thing with gooseberries and currants is to select disease-resistant varieties because there is white pine blister rust is a problem in Kentucky if you have white pines nearby, which a lot of us do. They are a fungal disease that has kind of a co-host with currants and white pines, so they need both plants to complete their life cycle. So you don't want to plant black currants that are susceptible to white pine blister rust. These are quite cold hardy, so can survive our winter temperatures well, but they like a little bit cooler temperatures than we have in Kentucky. So the summer heat tends to make them suffer a little bit. So for that reason, part shade is good, or a north-facing slope, somewhere that's a little bit cooler to help keep the roots a little bit cooler and protect from the summer heat. They will get highest yields with cross-pollination, but they're somewhat self-fertile. They're a small shrub, so usually about 3 to 6 feet high and spread. So these are some varieties recommended for Kentucky. Titania and Bensaric black currants are resistant to white pine blister rust. Then there's a few red and white currants that are recommended for Kentucky. For gooseberries, Hinnomaki red and Amish red. Hinnomaki red has kind of a raspberry flavor, really unique. So the texture on these is similar to a grape. You can see they almost look like grapes, except not in bunches like grapes. And these are summer ripening, so June to July is when you'll see currants and gooseberries ripening. Currants are quite tart and astringent, so you would not eat currants fresh. Usually they're almost always made into jam and jelly and juices and things that can be sweetened. Gooseberries are sweet enough that you can eat them fresh, but they can also be used in jam and baked goods, wine, things like that. So that is it. If anybody has any questions, I think we're close to noon, but I'd be glad to take a couple of questions, or I can hang around afterwards and answer some questions. I see one here.
It said on the list that you can make syrup from shagbark bark. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I have not done it, so that was actually new for me. That was something I found that I thought was interesting, so that's actually a new one for me, but it's not tapping it like you would tap maple trees for maple syrup. It's actually a process of boiling down the bark that peels off and boiling it down and kind of condensing it so the sugars come out. But honestly, I have not done it, so I would have to look into it a little bit more myself. But you can tap, I think black walnuts, you can actually put a tap in similar to maples. But yeah, the hickory, the shagbark syrup was more like boiling the bark down. So, did you have a question?
Particularly about this particular section, but do you know if the PowerPoints from today will be available after the session?
Well, I would be glad to make it available. The video, I think, will be online where you can watch the video afterwards, but I'm glad to send anybody the presentation that would like one. So I think lunch is ready, so I'm glad to hang around. No? Okay. Okay. Any other questions? I see one question over here.
when you plant?
Pretty much all of these, mulching is good. So she asked if you want to mulch all of these when you plant them. So mulching helps keep the soil moist, helps keep weeds down around trees. So pretty much all of these you want to mulch. Apples and peaches, you don't want to get the mulch too close to the tree because voles will get in and chew on the bark and can girdle the trees. They don't tend to bother pawpaws and persimmons for some reason, but yeah, mulch is good, except like I said, apples and peaches, you don't want it piled up right around the trunk. Any other questions?
Just off the top of your head, mulberry trees, I have a decent prolific mulberry tree on my property, and what can you share about that?
Mulberry, she asked about mulberries. What can we share about this? We have not done any work with mulberries. I know that they're easy to grow here, and you can make a lot, I've seen mulberry juice and mulberry jelly and things like that made out of mulberries. I don't have a lot of personal experience with mulberries, but I do know that they're well suited to growing in Kentucky. They grow well, and you can make a lot of products out of them. So yeah, that is a good option for another fruit. One more? Yes. Yes. So the question was about pawpaw nurseries. Pretty much any tree that you get from a nursery will be over 1.5 feet tall, and so you won't have to worry about the shading thing. Right. So they'll be ready to plant in the ground in full sun when you get them from the nursery. Yes.
For black walnuts, is there any kind of soil preparation that could help propagate the saplings quicker, or is there anything you need to worry about when you're trying to grow a large amount of black walnuts?
For black walnuts, was that the question?
From saplings, yeah.
Growing them from saplings. They like a lot of organic matter, so if you can get kind of some compost and mixed with a little bit of native soil, something that's really rich, has a lot of organic matter, but is well drained and is kind of loose, not anything that's too dense or heavy, is good for sapling or seedling production. Is there one more?
Yeah. Do you have any information on cedar apple rust for apple trees?
Well, most of those, she asked about cedar apple rust. Most of the cultivars I listed as being resistant are at least somewhat resistant to cedar apple rust, but cedar apple rust is similar to the white pine blister rust, that it needs an apple tree and a cedar tree to complete its life cycle. It gets on both plants. So if you have cedar trees and apple trees close together, then you can get white pine blister rust or cedar apple rust. But you want to make sure that you choose a resistant variety, and most of those I listed are resistant, but make sure in the listing that says resistant or at least not susceptible to cedar apple rust. And that's a fungal disease also. So again, with the leaf wetness, if you keep them pruned so that the leaves dry and don't stay wet a long time, that also helps prevent it as well. Any other questions? I think there's one more.
The question about the persimmons, whether or not being conducive to our zone 6, and that's in more of a dwarf rootstock to where it'd be
So
more harvestable.
For American persimmons?
Yes, that was the large one instead of the little marble ones.
They are cold hardy here, but they can be a little bit sensitive. We have lost a few to freezes. If they start growing and then you have an early freeze, they can be killed back by early freezes. But they're generally hardy to at least zone 6, if not zone 5. The Asian persimmon, or there's some that are hybrids between American persimmon and Asian persimmon, are the ones that aren't as cold hardy and won't grow well here. But American persimmon generally is cold hardy enough, unless we have a weird year where they start growing and then they freeze back. Then they're southern enough that that can bother them a little bit and can kill them back. But as long as they stay dormant, then yes, they're cold hardy. I think there's one more.
What about growing Asian pears here?
Asian pears, the biggest problem with Asian pears is they're susceptible to fire blight, which is a bacterial disease that we see in the spring. I think they're an interesting plant, and you can grow them here. You know, they're cold hardy, and there are people that grow them here, but they usually have to be sprayed for fire blight. That's the biggest problem or issue that you see with them. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's a good crop to grow here and something kind of interesting and unique. Any other questions? Well, that's good timing because I think we're getting close to lunch, so I'll turn it over for lunch break. So, but I'll be around a little bit if anybody has any questions, or it's on the screen anymore. But my email address, you feel free to email or call if you have any other questions. So, thank you.